Thank you for joining the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast with your host, Clayton Craddock.
Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My name is Clayton Craddock, and today my guest is Carter McLean.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on this with you.
You came to New York in the 2000s, 2001?
Yeah, I remember it really clearly because I came out right before my birthday is May 11th. So it was probably beginning of May 2001. And then, September 11th happened shortly after I moved to the city. I was working at Manny's Music on 48th Street when that whole street used to be music stores, you know?
You came here because you wanted to be a musician, but from what I understand, you were born in San Francisco and raised in Connecticut. You decided to go to Colorado, and you finally came to New York City. What made you decide to go to New York instead of to Nashville or LA?
I mean, I kind of thought just because I was from the East Coast that I would end up in New York. I just related better to people on the East Coast than I did to LA. And Nashville wasn't as popular back then as it is now. But I remember taking a lesson when I left college. I only went to school for a year, and I just didn't get along with most of my teachers, and I just didn't think it was worth the amount of money that it costs to get a piece of paper that says, okay, you can play your instrument. Like, I was like, I don't think I need this. So I convinced my mom. I dropped out of school, and then I told my mom. And she was totally cool with it because she knew I was super motivated about playing. And I said, why don't we use some of that money and I can just take some lessons with people that I really respect. And on one of those trips, I went to Peter Erskine's house in California and had a lesson with Peter in his studio. And, I still have the whole lesson on a mini disc tape, which I should digitize and post some of it because he said some really cool stuff. And he became like not a close friend, but like we're friendly. If I see him, I'll give him a hug. And he said, first he was like, man, I should call John Schofield and tell him you're the guy for the gig. And I was like, I remember going, well, there's the phone. But I said, where do you think I should go? New York, LA, or Nashville? And he goes, New York, 100%. I said, okay.
Why?
He didn't say why, but I was kind of already leaning that way. And I had been to LA and toured out there a little bit. I was just like, it's just not my thing. It just seemed like everybody was always looking over your shoulder at like who else is in the room, who they could be, connecting with, who's more important than talking to you. And I was just like, I'm not into this. And I love New York. I mean, I still do. I don't live there anymore, but I'm there almost. I'll be there tonight playing at 7:00.
And that playing 7:00 at the show called The Lion King, which you've been the drummer since 2011?
I took over in 2011. Yeah.
Wow.
That's 12 years ago. Wow.
I remember when you first got that. I think I might have seen you at the Starlight Deli across from the Schubert Theater. And you're like, yeah, I just got the gig at the Lion King. I was like, congratulations, man. That was I was working at Memphis the Musical at the time, and I was just very, very happy for you to finally get that gig after.
I remember that, actually. I think we were both in line, like checking out or something.
Yes.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, it's flown by. And then I subbed for 10 years before that. So I've been there 22 years.
Damn.
Like, because I toured with Melvin Sparks when I first moved to New York City, and I did a couple other gigs for people, and I did like a few jingles, if people even know what that business is kind of like gone, and did some sessions and stuff. But then I remember getting asked to sub on the show, and I was out with Melvin Sparks. So I'm like playing all this soul jazz stuff, which is like couldn't be more opposite than learning a Broadway show. I mean, those gigs, you show up and you just groove for 3 hours. Broadway show is like, oh, you missed that little accent on the E of 3 in bar 89. Like, yeah, you got to go work on that. So yeah, I mean, I started subbing on that show almost like within a year.
Before we get into The Lion King, what was it that made you say, I want to be a professional drummer?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know I always listened to music when it was on. And this is probably like the age of 8, maybe even younger. Might have been 7. But I remember I was at a friend's house in Long Island. They had like a summer house on the beach in Long Island, and we were there visiting them for like a couple nights. And I remember Born in the USA or something. It was a Bruce Springsteen song, was just coming out. And it was on the radio. And I remember for whatever reason, that tune had like, you could just hear the hi-hat, kick, snare like really clearly. And I remember kind of seeing, because MTV, that's back when MTV like played videos and it was all music. That was it. So I kind of remember seeing like a video of like a guy doing this, and then it kind of clicked like, oh, that's the hi-hat sound that goes tut, 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 tut. And then the kick and snare. So I remember making a phone book drum kit, and I just put my foot on the ground, and I probably had 2 phone books as a snare and a hi-hat. And I remember showing my mom, I'm like, hey, this is how you play a drum beat. And she was like, huh. And I didn't think much about it until like maybe a year later. And then I started getting into more into music. And I was like, I think I want to play the drums.
Did you have any members of your family that were musical?
No, my mom, I mean, my dad was a stockbroker. So he was into music, but like, you know, that wasn't his world. And my mom was an interior designer. And like her dream would have been like a backup singer for Tina Turner or the Pointer Sisters or something. But like, you know, can't sing a note. Love you, Mom, but can't sing. But there was, you know, music in the house, you know, but no like instruments or anything.
Did they buy you a practice pad after that, or a drum set?
Well, I remember like in 5th grade, you had to pick like xylophone, like one of those like, it was like a 6-note big marimba that would sit on the floor, and you could either do that or recorder or snare drum. And I'm like, snare drum is obviously the coolest choice out of these 3 instruments. So I remember they gave me a pair of JoJo drumsticks, which, I mean, that's old school. This is like 1985 or something. They had plastic tips, and it said JoJo in orange letters. I bet Regal Tip made them because it had that kind of glossy finish. And then that Remo practice gray generic practice pad that everybody had. And I think they gave me like a book. I forget which book. I don't think it was Stick Control, but some basic book, which I never looked at. And I just kind of like hit it, and I was like, well, this isn't fun. Like, this thing doesn't make any sound. And I remember kind of like throwing it in my closet and going like, eh. And then I started seeing like videos of drummers playing. This is when like Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction was coming out, and like that, whatever year that is, 88. So I was probably 9 or 10. So I think I started actually wanting to play drum set at like 10. And I started mowing lawns all summer. And my dad was like, look, if you mow our lawn and like neighbors' lawns and stuff all summer in the neighborhood, I'll buy you a drum set at the end of the summer. I was like, okay. And then we went in the newspaper, because the internet wasn't even a thing. And we went on the newspaper in the classifieds, and like in Bridgeport, Connecticut, this dude was selling like a rack tom, a kick, and some like whack snare drum. And that was it. Like no cymbals. So I got those 3 drums. I think it had a bass drum pedal, but I had no hi-hat stand or cymbals. And then I was like, well, there's a hi-hat thing. And then we went to a music store and bought a hi-hat. And then I started playing to like Guns N' Roses records and stuff like that on the radio. And that was like, once that happened and I could play boom, pops, boom, boom, pops, boom, I was like, I'm ready. Let's go.
Did you wind up playing in any bands that were, you know, friends of yours that you formed like a garage band with after that?
I didn't have anybody to play with. So I asked my brother, I was like, man, you should play guitar so we could play. That'd be fun. And he was like, you know, classic older brother. He was just like, oh, I don't think I want to do that. And then like 2 weeks later, he's like, I think I'm going to play guitar. It was his idea. I was like, okay, cool. So he started playing guitar, started learning Rolling Stones tunes, Black Crowes tunes, classic rock stuff that's pretty straight ahead. And then he got really good. And then, you know, so now there's no bass player, right? I'm like, well, all these bands have a bass player. I was listening to like Van Halen and whatever. So then I go to my best friend. I was like, hey, man, you should play bass. And he was like, oh, that's cool. He was into it. So he like literally started taking bass lessons, bought a Washburn Black. I remember he had it as bass. And we started, that was our first band. And then we needed a second guitar player. So my brother's best friend started playing guitar. And that was our first band. It was called Aerial Assault.
I love the band names from when we were kids.
Dude, it gets better. There's a couple more after that. So that band name seemed a little intense, right? And so we changed it to Liquid Chicken.
Was there a bigger meaning behind that?
I don't think so. I think we were just young, stupid kids. Like, what's the grossest thing? And somebody was like, Liquid Chicken. I'm like, well, there we go. There's our new. And we won Battle of the Bands every year.
Really?
Actually, I won it 6 years in a row because when my brother was a freshman in high school, I was in seventh grade, but I could still play in the competition because it was his band, right? So I mean, how old are you in seventh grade? Like 13?
12, yeah, 12, 13.
12? So I was 12 and we just rolled every band.
What were you guys playing? I'm curious.
Like some originals. I remember we played Couldn't Stand the Weather, Stevie Ray Vaughan. And what's crazy is I got to find this out, but John Mayer grew up out here in Fairfield. He went to Fairfield High School. And I remember one year we played a Battle of the Bands at Fairfield High School where I think he went. And I don't remember, but I just remember this guy in one of the other bands there was blazing on guitar. And it was the first time I heard someone else like in our age group that was really good. And I remember it was like, man, that guy kind of sounds like Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I know he's super into Stevie Ray Vaughan. So I was wondering if like that was him, if we like competed against him in a Battle of the Bands, because he's only like a year older than I am.
Have you met him yet?
We chat a little bit on Instagram, like mostly about watches. Like we don't really talk about music, but I should ask him. I should be like, man, did you do like a Battle of the Bands in like 1990, whatever, 4? I mean, I probably did.
Were your parents supportive of you pursuing a career in music as opposed to doing something practical like being on Wall Street?
Yeah, I mean, shockingly, my dad, I mean, I lost my dad when I was 14 suddenly, unfortunately, but he got to see me get pretty into it. You know what I mean? Like he got to see me playing when I got like my first real kit, and like I could play back then, you know? So he would stand like in the back of a gig if it was like an outdoor town event, and I'd see him, and you could tell he was like proud and was like, oh, this is actually not so bad. They're pretty good. And my mom is a pretty creative person, and she was always like, go for it, you know, like, and I think I was lucky. I got a lot of people that were like, saw what I was up to at a pretty early age and were like very encouraging to like, man, you should do this. Like, you know, if people were kind of like, A, not paying attention, or B, like, hey, maybe you should do something else, then I probably would have, you know, because you're a kid, you kind of take clues from the adults or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's weird. Like, you know, I worked retail in high school, you know, but like, other than that, I've really just been a musician my whole life.
Who were you listening to back in the late 80s, other than, Guns N' Roses and Van Halen? What drummers were you like, man, God, that person's great?
Well, it went from like 0 to 100. So it started off like, I didn't know anybody in the bands. Like, I don't know who's in Guns N' Roses or blah, blah, blah. Then I started learning names like, oh, Steven Adler, Alex Van Halen, you know, Tommy Lee, Tico Torres. Like, that's when all the hair metal stuff was like, that was the stuff. And then I kind of like figured out that most of those beats in general were kind of the same thing. And I'm like, okay, well, I can do that. Like, I want to challenge myself to something else. And this is a funny story. I'll try to make it quick. But I remember getting into like Chick Corea Electric Band. It was like fusion, right? It wasn't like, you know, Elvin. It was fusion. And I could kind of relate to it because a lot of it kind of had a backbeat and like electric guitar. And it was kind of like rock on steroids. So it was a natural progression from like Rush, right? Oh, I also went through a really hardcore Rush phase for like probably 2 years, maybe less, maybe a year. But like, remember when you'd have a cassette tape like travel case thing?
Yes.
So, and it held like maybe 20 tapes. Every slot was a Rush tape.
Really?
Everyone, in chronological order. And I knew every fill to every record and da-da-da-da. But then I hear Weckl and Vinny and Gad and those guys. And I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? Because you're going from boom, boom, tats, do do ga do da to like do da 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 da, like to crazy stuff. And so I start buying Dave Weckl tapes, and this is crazy. I'll make this quick. So he did a record called Master Plan, where it's like pretty well known amongst drummers, right? He's on the cover with like the rack of gear. So I'm in my music class in 7th grade, and I have the cassette tape in my Walkman on my desktop, and I'm like trying to figure out what this guy is doing, right? And my music teacher, Mrs. Montero, comes over to me, grabs the tape, and goes, "Why do you have this?" And got kind of like weird. And I was like, took my headphones off. I go, what? And she's like, why do you have this tape? And I was like, because I'm learning how to play the drums, and this guy is incredible. His name's Dave Weckl. She goes, that's my boyfriend.
What?
So my music teacher was dating Dave because he lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
And him and Joel Rosenblatt were roommates. And Joel's become a good friend. And he was like, oh, yeah, I totally met your music teacher. I know exactly who you're talking about. I was like, this is crazy. So that was weird. That made me go like, that's very strange that this one drummer I'm trying to shed, my music teacher is dating. But from there, it got into like, Gad, Vinny, Tony Williams, like all that stuff. And I discovered Tony kind of not late, but like I was probably 18 or 19, like freshman in college, however old you are then. And then I was like, Tony Williams is my guy. Like Tony, John Bonham, and then like third place is like 500 drummers between like, Elvin, Max, Roy Haynes, like whoever you want to, Jack, DeJohnette, like all those guys, There's so many great players. It's like the same thing. Like, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite color? Like, I don't know. The variety of life is great. And there's so many good people to listen to. There's no reason to listen to a shitty drummer. It's like, especially now, kids now have so much technique, right? I feel like you have two faders or two knobs, and it's like technique and musicality, right? And like now everybody's technique is like through the roof, but their musicality is like kind of down here. So it's just like a chops fest that makes no sense for anything. So I wish people would have both. And I would take musicality over chops every day of the week. I mean, Jim Keltner is one of my favorite drummers, and you'll never hear that guy go. He'll go like da da, and it's like the coolest shit you've ever heard.
That's true. Speaking of another musical person on your left, another Steve, but Stevie Wonder is a great drummer too. Stuff he played on those albums, man.
But I met one of his drummers who's on, I think it's Intervisions, and he played with Bowie, Let's Dance.
Dennis
Davis.
Yes.
So I met him when I was working at Manny's. He came in and invited me to sit in with Roy Ayers up in Harlem one night.
What?
Real story, dude. It was out of a movie. It was crazy. I was practicing on the kits at Manny's because it was the only place I could shed. And I was like, oh, I'm just tuning the kits. And I'd play for like 30 minutes. And he walked up. I don't know if you remember, you'd go upstairs to the drum department. And I was in that first room playing, and I didn't know who he was. And he goes, man, you work here? I was like, yeah, what can I do for you? And he's just like, you shouldn't be working here, man. You should be playing. And I was like, oh, cool. I was like, thanks. I go, do you play in the city? He goes, yeah, I play with Stevie Wonder. I play with David Bowie. I was like, okay. This is like pre-cell phones. Like, I wasn't about to just go, who is this dude, and look it up. I go, okay. And he goes, I'm playing tonight with Roy Ayers in Harlem. You should come and sit in. And I'm like, I remember I went, is that safe? Because I had just moved to this city, and he's like, because I said, what time's the gig? He goes, it's midnight to 3 a.m.
Holy cow.
It was like on 140th or something. You open the door, and it goes like down. And so when you open the door, everyone can see who's coming in. And I remember it was like a movie. I opened the door, and the needle went, and everyone looked back and was like, who is this kid? And Dennis saw me from all the way at the back of the stage. He was playing, and he goes like this, come up. And I'm like, oh, shit, I just walked in here. So I start making my way back around to the back by the stage, and he's playing the tune. Roy Ayers is soloing on a mallet cat. Remember those?
Yeah.
I thought was kind of weird. I was like, you're on a mallet cat, dude? Okay. And then Dennis was like, get up here. And they're mid-tune. He's soloing. And I'm like, okay, so we do the handoff. He's playing the feet. I start playing hi-hat snare. Then he gets up. I get in, start playing the kick drum. And the groove was just a straight groove. It was a funk groove or something simple. It's just great. I wish I had video of this stuff because it's in my brain as like a movie reel from my perspective. Right, I'm playing, kind of freaking out, and Dennis is like, great, and he like went to the bar. And Roy Ayers turns around at the end of his solo thinking it's going to see Dennis. And he goes, "Who the fuck are you?" And I was like, "Sorry, I'm friends with Dennis." And he's just like, "Whatever." And we kept playing. Well, we played like 2 more tunes.
Oh, really?
And then Dennis came back. He's like, "Man, that sounded great." I have a lot of crazy stories like that.
Well, I want to go back. You decided to go to school for music in Colorado. And why'd you choose that school as opposed to Berkeley or University of North Texas or anywhere else? Juilliard.
Well, I was going to go. A friend of mine who was a year older was at the Manhattan School of Music, I think. And so I went to go hang with him one day and check out what like the vibe was at the school. And everyone there was like, "Man, if you don't sound like Elvin, I don't want to even talk to you." And I was just, everyone just had this weird vibe. And I'm like, man, this is not the place for me. Like, that's not the energy I want to deal with for 4 years. And then I kept thinking, like, you know what? I actually want to get out. Berkeley wasn't even on my radar. I heard of so many people going to Berkeley and dropping out and getting gig or just like not. And I also know a ton of people that went and graduated from Berkeley that can't play. So I was just like, I'm not going there. So I went to Colorado because I figured any music school at a college level would be able to show me a ton of stuff. And I was a huge skier. I was a huge climber. I mean, I almost became a ski patrol as a gig. Like, I was not going to play drums. I was so into skiing and being in the outdoors and camping. I was like, maybe I'll just live out here and just play drums for fun. And that's why I went out there. It was beautiful. It was sunny 340 days a year, whatever they have. And it's a beautiful place to live. If anybody's ever been to Boulder, Colorado, it's stunning. And of course, I get into like the top graduate jazz ensemble as a freshman and like got into the top big band or whatever as a freshman. So then all the senior drummers that were there were now not my friends because I took their spot basically. So I had no friends in the drum department from like the day I got there because people were pissed. They were like, that was supposed to be my chair. And I remember telling one guy that came up to me who was like a senior or something. He goes, "Man, that was my chair this year." And I go, "Well, obviously it's not." Like, dude, if you're going to be a dick to me, I'm not going to be your buddy. Like, I tried to be friends with everybody there. I mean, I ended up making friends with a lot of people. They just weren't drummers. And I became really good friends with the band director who was not my percussion teacher, Greg Carroll. And I think he ended up working for IAJE or something in the future. He was dope. He played drum set a little bit, but played mallets like really well. And he was great. He was very cool and always was like, "Man, I'm psyched you're in my band. Like, you're a big asset." And he was very cool. I remember having a talk with him and I said, "Man, I don't think the school thing is for me, dude." I was just like, I don't feel like I'm learning a lot in the music department. And he took me aside and he was like, "I get it." He goes, "I don't think you should be in a music degree." He goes, "If you want to do school, I will keep you. I want you to stay in our bands because we need you." They made an exception. You had to be in the music program to be in the bands. But I withdrew from the music program and tried to do another year as a general major. I was doing like math and ceramics and Spanish and just taking all the classes. And I hated that too. I was just like, all I wanted to do was play. I already had a deal with DW at that time.
Hey, so how did you get that at that age?
So here's another crazy story. So go back to high school. Our high school had these fundraisers for the band called Jazz on Sundays. And twice a year we would bring in a band that people would pay tickets for, and that money would go towards the high school band. And my band director, John Mastriani, was a pretty burning alto player. Like, he would play with Louis Bellson and all the bands that would come through town. He asked me one year, he said, "Who do you think we should get this year?" And I said, "Man, you should get Bela Fleck and the Flecktones." And I was like a huge fan of them. And they just released this record called Tales from the Acoustic Planet. I think it was 1996 or 7 probably. And they said yes. So my favorite band at the time, which is kind of an avant-garde band to be into in high school, is coming to my high school. So I was freaking out. I'm like, can I come to sound check and help them load in? Like, if I can meet them, it would be amazing. So Victor Wooten walks off the bus. He had a parakeet on his shoulder. Like, it was crazy. It was like the circus showed up at my high school. And then Roy Wooten, Future Man, got off the bus, and I was like, oh my God, that's the guy who plays drums on this crazy thing. So long story short, I became pretty tight with Roy that night. And at the end of the concert, I went up to Bela and I said, hey man, I know your whole new record. Is there any way the two of us could just play a couple tunes, just like acoustically, which is pretty ballsy for a high school kid. And Bela looked at me and was like, he goes, you know the songs? And I was like, yeah. And I did. And they're all in like 7, 13, like crazy time signatures. And he goes, well, what are you going to play? And I was like, I have brushes in my locker. I can play brushes on a tabletop or something. He's like, all right, go get them. And I could tell he was kind of like, let's see if this kid can play. So I remember he started this first tune as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's in 7. And he just counted it off and we started playing and I was like hanging. And then Vic Wooten came over and like heard us jamming in the hall and brought his upright over and started playing with us. And then Roy came over and started playing a trash can. So like the four of us were playing. And we probably played for like 15 minutes. It was really cool. So this is a transition to like a lot of stuff. So through meeting Roy, he worked with this company called Zendrum. That was a MIDI percussion controller that they were basically trying to replicate what he was doing. That became like a mass product for like Peter Gabriel used it. Manu Katché used it on one of their, I think it was the Us tour. Like, I think David Romero with Earth, Wind and Fire and Sonny Emery were using it at the time. Like people were using it. Mick Fleetwood was using it. It was kind of nuts. They saw what I got into it and contacted the company, and they saw that I was really into this, and they flew me to the NAMM show in LA when I was a senior in high school. And they were like, can you do some demos for us at the booth? We really like what you're doing. Because most people were just hitting the thing. Mm-hmm. And I saw how Roy was breaking it up. Like his middle finger was the kick drum. This finger was snare. This was hi-hat. And then all of this stuff was like percussion and other hi-hats and stuff. So like you could play a whole groove just with one hand. So I went out there and all of a sudden I was like, holy shit, there's like, Kenwood Denard, and there's like Vernon Reid, and there's da-da-da-da, and there's like Vince Neil from Motley. Like it was crazy. And so I ended up meeting a bunch of people at NAMM when I was doing these demos. I think I was 17, and DW Drums was across from me from our booth. The NAMM is like every 5 feet there's a new company, and I had never played a DW kit, so I snuck over and wanted to just play one of their drums. And they had a kit with a pair of sticks. And so, if you've been to NAMM, the typical thing at NAMM is you just sit down and blaze as loud and fast as to get noticed as you can. And I didn't know any of this, right? I was literally going over trying not to be noticed, playing quiet. I didn't want someone from DW to come over and go, hey kid, you can't be on this, $20,000 kit. So I remember sitting down playing some like light Idris Muhammad kind of feel or something. And all of a sudden, this guy came over with a Yankees cap on, and he was smoking, this older guy. And he was like, hey, kid, you got the touch. And I was like, who's this dude smoking in the convention center? And it turned out to be this guy, Freddie Gruber, who was like a pretty famous teacher. I didn't know who he was. But I just remember him smoking in my face in the convention center. I'm like, who is this crazy dude? And then when that happened, John Good from DW walked over and said, hey, I want to talk to you. And I got freaked out and thought I was in trouble. So I just got up and left. I took off. And he saw me the next day, John Good, and saw me at the booth at Zendrum and said, come here. And I'm like, oh man, I'm in trouble for playing that drum set. And he said, I want to know what you're doing. I want to know who you are. And I want to give you an endorsement.
Damn.
And I was like, okay. What? I was like, what's a drum endorsement? So that's how that happened with the endorsement thing.
Wow.
It's a long way to explain it, but it's the most succinct.
So you had a drum endorsement at 17?
Yeah.
And did they give you a drum set, or was it
they made me a kit.
What?
Yeah, they were like, I remember them on the phone. It was a cherry stain, and it was just regular, stainless steel colored hardware or whatever. And they were like, hey, if you want, we can do gold hardware for free. And I was like, yeah, that's dope. Not real gold, but like brass plated or whatever. And yeah, they were cool. I was with them for a long time.
You still have that drum set?
Sold it. I wish I kept my first real Pearl kit. That was like my first kit my dad got me. that was like, I remember I was obsessed with Peter Gabriel and Manu Katché and that Secret World Live video, and he had a blue Yamaha kit. And I remember seeing that set, and it just made such an impact on me that I was like, I want to get that 10, 12, 13, 16 and like a rack. And, I'd been playing for a bunch of years on like a total broken drum kit. And my dad was like, all right, it's time. And I remember for Christmas, that's all I asked for. I was like, I want a new drum set. And he knew what I wanted. And so I remember that Christmas, my brother was opening all these gifts, and they're like, here's a pair of socks. And I was like, okay. And then they were like, Christmas is over, let's go have breakfast. And I'm like, I had like a pair of socks and like an ornament. My brother had all this shit. And I'm like, I go, man, what did I do this year that was so wrong? Like, what's up? And my dad, like, we were sitting for breakfast, and my dad was waiting to see if I was going to start complaining. And I just remember being like, I didn't say anything, but I was just like, man, what did I do wrong? And he goes, oh, there's one more thing in the living room that I forgot to let you open. And I was like, what? And I was like already bummed out. So I walked in the living room, and the kit was just stacked up in there.
Oh, man.
It was like one of the best memories as being a kid. I was just like, holy shit, I couldn't believe it. I didn't eat any breakfast. I just started taking the drums downstairs and setting them up.
That's cool, man.
Yeah. I wish I still had that kit. Somebody's got it. It's a BLX sheer blue pearl kit.
So you were at college, you had a DW endorsement, you figured out college wasn't for you. You left, you didn't want to move to LA or Nashville, came back to the East Coast. Did you immediately start working at Manny's?
Yeah, I was like, man, I got to have a job, because I remember my first apartment I was sharing with 3 people, and my chunk of it was still $1,000 a month.
Back then, wow.
Yeah, and I was like, I go, well, my paycheck at Manny's is $250 a week before I start making commissions. They gave me a deal because I had a deal already with DW, and I knew some people in the industry or whatever. So they're like, we'll pay you the $250, and anything you sell on top of that, you get immediately as commission. So I think I was the worst salesman. Kid would bring up like a whack cymbal that sounded horrible, and I'm like, dude, you don't want to buy that, man. And my manager was like, dude, let him buy the cymbal. I go, it sounds awful. I was like, you should save up and buy a real one. And they're like, do not say that. Like, you got to sell stuff. And I'm like, so I was a horrible salesman. I was just honest with people.
How long did you work there?
Not long. Probably, I made a promise to myself, because I saw a lot of people that worked in music stores, they just stayed forever. I said, at the minute I get a call for a gig, I'm putting in my 2 weeks. And just to make yourself get out,
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to just go, all right, well, I'll just make like this basic amount of money. Like, for me to go out and buy a beer was like a big deal, because I had no money. I was making $1,000, maybe $1,100 a month at my job, 40-hour weeks, and my rent was $1,000. It was brutal.
Is that where Melvin Sparks came into the picture?
Yeah, and I started teaching too, because I was like, man, I used to teach a little bit when I was in Colorado. Like, I had done a clinic at a guitar center out there, and I realized like people wanted to ask me about my hands or whatever. And I was like, oh, maybe I could teach. It was never like something I wanted to do, but I did it because I needed to make money to pay my rent or like buy dinner. You know what I mean? So I started teaching a group of kids like on the Upper East Side for a while that I taught for a long time, actually. And that's totally helped. And I think I was charging maybe $75 an hour at the time. But like, if I was making $250 a week, $75 an hour was like, this is great.
Mm-hmm.
And it really did help. But yeah, then I forget exactly how Melvin and I got in touch, but I want to say he talked to Charlie Hunter. And I knew Charlie at the time because we used to open up for him when we were in Colorado. And I think he recommended me to Melvin, because I just got a phone call at Manny's. And I guess he had heard I worked in the drum department at Manny's. And he heard you're the man. So do you want to play? My name's Melvin Sparks. And I was like, okay. I was just like, I don't know who this dude is, but okay. And I go, who was your drummer before? And he was like, Idris Muhammad. It's like, oh, okay. Damn. Like one of my favorite drummers.
Yeah.
And Idris was alive at the time. And he was my first record I did with Melvin, Idris was supposed to be on that session. It was him and, what's the keyboard player's name? I'll think of it in a minute. He was supposed to be on the session, and Idris couldn't make it last minute. And so he called me to do it, to fill in. And I was just like, okay, no pressure. So that was how that transitioned from music store to the gig. And I remember as soon as Melvin said, come by my house, we can play a couple tunes. I said, okay, cool. I put in my 2 weeks that day.
From Melvin Sparks, you said, you know what? I don't want to do this Melvin Sparks thing. I want to play Broadway shows.
That never happened. That's not something that, like, to be straight up, I had never even seen a Broadway show.
Really?
And the whole way I got on Lion King was, it was right before 9/11 happened. So pretty shortly after I moved to the city, there was this show that was going to be, they were doing rehearsals, and it was going to be called Raise the Roof. And Michael Lanehart was playing trumpet on it, who I knew from Steely Dan. And I was just like, oh, these are like legit players in this band. I auditioned for it. I do not remember how I got on that audition, but I ended up making the band or whatever. We were rehearsing, and then 9/11, like, we were going to go to like off Broadway or something, or like previews to like do the show. There was money behind it. And then 9/11 happened, and it just was like, this is over. We're not doing this. I was just like, oh, okay. But I remember when I got a call, because I was a DW artist at the time, and the guy who was playing Lion King at the time was also a DW artist, right? So I remember they gave me his number and said, hey, if you ever have questions about anything in New York, he plays on Broadway. He's a good guy to know. And I was just like, well, okay, cool. But like, I moved to New York to play with like Sting, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel. That's what I wanted to do. And now I know all my friends have those gigs, which is funny. And they're all killing on those gigs. So I called this guy, and just to get I didn't know what the money was supposed to be for this off-Broadway like reading situation. And I asked him, he's like, well, yeah, you got to be a union member, and that's totally standard union pay. And he was like, you know, if that doesn't work out, I'm looking for a sub that's like young in the city, if you want to come up and look at the book. And I was just like, yeah, okay, cool. I just didn't think much of it. I'm like, you know, it's Disney music. You know, how hard could that be, right? And so I went up. I remember after the Raise the Roof thing got canceled, I went up to watch him play. And I remember sitting in the room going like, okay, like I can play all of this stuff technically, but like there's a lot of little starts and stops and bass drum roll, and then it's a cymbal crash, and then you're doing this. So I was like, I just need to figure out the choreography of the flow of the show. That's to me the hardest part of a show. It's not really the playing. There's no like shredding in 13/8 on the gig, you know. I mean, there are some percussion breaks that are weird, and there's some weird measures here and there, but like it just gets built into the show in your head. And so that's how I ended up at Lion King, was through calling him, basically saying, is this money correct for this other thing? I wasn't like, hey man, I want a sub for you. And then I became like the first call sub there. I was in like 3-4 shows a week, which is a lot.
Then you were offered the show, and then you became the drummer, and you've been the chair holder ever since. Now, how do you keep yourself from not getting burned out from playing the same show the same way every night, 8 shows a week?
It's like a roller coaster. I will say this. I am very aware of how lucky of a gig it is to have, right? To like be in a position as a musician to go, I can play every night of the week if I want. And know while the show's running, I can make X amount this year if I want to. That's like so rare, right? So I know that. That being said, after you play a show literally 5,000 times, right? We hit 10,000 shows like a couple months ago, right? I've probably done at least half of those. So once you do whatever, even if it's 4,000, it's like a lot, right? And it's exactly the same. There's no like, oh, tonight I'm going to do this kind of groove. It's like, no, you're going to do the same groove you did last night and the same groove you did 22 years ago. So the thing is now, right? So a bunch of people are like, man, you should be out touring with John Mayer or doing a big pop gig. Like you'd be out there killing it. And I'm like, yeah, except I'm not doing that because he's got Steve Jordan or Aaron Sterling or whoever's on these gigs, or Steve Ferrone's out with so-and-so. Like there's plenty of great drummers that are killing their gigs, right? So I feel lucky to have a gig. So that just keeps me kind of straight knowing that. And it's a job, right? It's not like, I could be like digging a hole in the middle of like a highway somewhere. It's 110 degrees, right? So it's like, yeah, it's a job, but I'm in my own air conditioned room with a refrigerator and a couch and a TV that I put in. It's just like, I'm basically in an apartment. It's as comfortable as you can get. So boo-hoo, But that being said, I have had offers to go out on the road with people. And dude, the money out there is not incredible for tours anymore. I mean, unless you're with a huge artist, and even then, if you're not a member of that band, you're just like the hired dude or girl, it's not as good as Broadway typically. It's actually usually a lot less. Like I got offered a gig to do some stuff, and it was like a 10-day run to start, and this artist was like, you're my number one call. I would be so psyched if you would do this. And I was like, okay, cool. How much is it a week that you're offering? And they said a number, and I said, is that a day or a week? I mean, that should just tell you what I'm talking about. I mean, it's like the money was like, I would lose thousands of dollars just to go out.
How do you avoid drumming injuries playing the same thing the same way every night?
To continue producing the high-quality podcast you're listening to, publishing engaging newsletter content, and posting YouTube videos, we would appreciate any financial contributions you can make. At this time, we have no advertisers, and we'd like to keep it that way. Our staff is small but growing. We can only produce the show with listener contributions from people like you. There are a couple of ways you can do that. You can sign up to be a monthly or annual subscriber at BroadwayDrumming101.com. You can also contribute any amount you wish through PayPal at paypal.me/BroadwayDrumming101 or through Venmo at BroadwayDrumming101. We appreciate any support you can give. Don't forget to subscribe to the Broadway Drumming 101 YouTube page. You'll find more content that isn't featured on the podcast or on the Broadway Drumming 101 Instagram page. Make sure when you subscribe to the YouTube page, you click on the button to be notified when a new video is published. Be sure to visit our new shop at merchandise.broadwaydrumming101.com. Thanks again for listening to the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast.
Funny you should ask that. So I've never had an injury from drumming.
Really?
But I just jacked up. I don't know what I did. My wife's an acupuncturist and herbalist, so she knows all of this stuff, and she actually treated my arm the other day. Knock on wood, I've been very lucky with drumming stuff. But like I do a lot of, once you buy a house, you got a lot of outdoor maintenance, and like I just had a dump truck dump a massive pile of gravel outside that I had to move around. So I was shoveling gravel for like 4 or 5 hours. And I took breaks and tried to be, use my legs, don't use my back because I'm 45. So it's like I'm not 20 anymore. And it was like 2-3 days later, this started to feel really crazy in here. And when I would bend my arm like this, it still feels kind of weird. So first thing, if you own a house or are doing labor in any sort of way, pay someone else to do it because you will hurt yourself. But as far as if you're just drumming to avoid injuries, study with a teacher that knows what good and bad technique looks like. Try to relax when you're playing. Don't play like this. A lot of people play really tight or real like blocky. Most of my playing is like my shoulders are down. A lot of it's all wrists and fingers. That's like I very rarely am doing this kind of stuff. And it can be misleading because I just had this new sub check out the show, and it doesn't look like I'm hitting that hard. And so the last show they played, they're like, he's got to hit harder. And I even said, it doesn't look like I'm hitting hard, but I'm probably playing double forte right now. But you can create a ton of torque just in that motion. You know what I mean? And that's just from my wrist. If I hit someone on their hand, I'd probably break their hand if I did that. Or I could be in here with my fingers and still get a good sound. Just try to play loose and with good technique. The more relaxed you are, the bigger sound you can get out of your drums.
I don't know how you balance your approach inside of a pit as opposed to outside? Do you use, I guess you use the same technique and same approach?
Yeah, I've never been one to like, I don't like when I'm on stage or whatever. If you can see me, whether I'm in the studio tracking for an artist and they're sitting, like I had a guy out here, we just did his record from Nashville. He flew up and stayed at the studio for 2 days. We banged out like 10 tracks or something, I forget. But he was just in here staring at me while I was doing takes. And I'm not like trying to show, you know what I mean? Like, I don't really give a shit what I look like. I'm so focused on the sound and what is everything grooving? Am I playing the right tempo? Is this bass drum part cool? Are these sounds right? I don't really care what I'm doing. So I'm trying to play as efficiently as possible. And it's more about sound. And like, you know, if you grip the stick real tight and you're hitting like all blocky, the drums they react differently. They sound different. Cymbals sound different, you know? So my favorite drummers have always had a powerful sound, but also look kind of loose, you know, for the, you know, watch Brian Blade play. He's just like, dude is a magician. But when he hits something hard, it blows you off your chair, you know? So he's saving his energy for those moments where they actually matter. But I mean, to me, it boils down to just having good technique, being loose. You don't grip the stick to death. You have, you know, I tell students when I teach in person, like when I do clinics, I'm like, you know, how hard are you holding the stick? And I said, the only way I can explain it for you is come up and pull the stick out of my hand. See how much resistance there is. I can't say it's medium tension. That's different for everybody. So I say, look, this is how I hold the stick when I play. Now pull the stick out of my hand. And there's no resistance. I feel like that's the only way to explain it to somebody is like, if you're there, just go, cool, pull it out of my hand. You'll see. It's like a loose grip.
If somebody wants to move to New York and eventually be fortunate enough to have their own Broadway show like yourself, what do you think that they should know?
First and foremost, if you say you can play something, you better be able to play it. Because in New York, people don't have time for like, oh, I can do this, I can do that. And then you hear them and they can't. It's like, I would just delete that person out of my phone. Like, that's out. Because how are you supposed to count on somebody like that, right? I want somebody to, under promise and over deliver or whatever. Like, you know, and you can kind of tell when people can play because they're usually like a little more quiet. They're not so outgoing typically. They're not like, oh, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. I'm going to show you how good I am. And it's just like, then I look at what they've done and I'm like, yeah, you've done all that, but none of it sounds good. So I don't really care. So first thing, if you move to New York and you want to be a Broadway drummer, you got to open up your scope because even that's a small world, right? So if you want to be a drummer in New York, you should be able to play a funk gig, a hip hop gig, a Latin gig, a big band gig, a Broadway show, a rock show, a singer-songwriter gig at Rockwood. Like, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to do all of that stuff, right? So that would be the first thing. Like, have your bases covered, have good technique, have really good time, know what it's like to hook up with a bass player or MD playing keyboards, and you got to follow that keyboard player the whole show because they're not conducting, right? I hadn't worked with a conductor since I was in high school when I did Lion King, and I was like, oh, right, conducting. I forgot that there's a and one. I thought the and was one.
Interesting.
There's a prep. So, I mean, that's a really basic thing, but that's real important. So you're not on the and of four, you're on one, you know?
Now, why would you say you should play all those 10 different styles of music when somebody says, I just want to play Broadway? I don't want to do all the other stuff. I look at my Instagram. I play, you know, all the classic theater stuff. I just want to play theater.
Yeah, I don't even know what that means when people say that. I'm like, well, here's the deal. At my show, right, I've only done 2 shows. I did Rent when it came back off Broadway, which is just like, cool. You can play a rock gig, rock pop gig. You can do that show. Great. And then I subbed at In the Heights for a second. I got fired from that gig. Here's a great story. I went, learned the show, played it once, said, hey, how'd it go? This is hard. It's like half hip hop, half Latin. They're like, felt great, really good. And I knew Wilson wouldn't BS me. I said, tell me if it's not good. Great. Second show, I have a tape of it. I recorded both shows. Second show, the MD was like, hey, I need to talk to you in my office after the show. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. I was just expecting a bunch of notes like, oh, work on this, work on this. He said, well, this isn't going to work out. And I said, what's not going to work out? And he said, well, I don't think you can play here anymore. And I said, I was like, okay, cool. I just said, any reason why? He's like, well, on measure 52 of song 8, you hit a crash cymbal and there's no crash on that measure. And I was like, okay, well, like, it was my second show. I won't do it next time. And then he goes, well, it's not really about the playing. And then I was like, okay, I don't know what that means, but that's out of my control at this point. I thought I was hired to come in to play. So I just was like, all right, F y'all, I'm out. So I left and went back subbing at Lion King a bunch. Actually, shortly after that, I got the gig at Lion King. But they asked me to come back like 6 months later because they were having trouble finding people. They're like, hey, could you come back? And I was like, no. Like, you guys fired me on my second gig because I hit a crash cymbal.
Wow.
Right. So there's another side of the story. Like, it doesn't always work out, even though you might have done a 95% job or 98% job. You get fired sometimes. Like, whatever. Let's move on. You know what I mean? Don't let that stop you. That's a real lesson. My point is why you should be able to play all these styles. At Lion King, you got to be able to play African drum breaks. You got to be able to play a shuffle from New Orleans in your left hand, which a lot of people can't do. It's not a it's with one hand.
Wow.
Right? So a lot of people can't do that. So you have to have your technique together. You got to be able to play a rock tune really well. You got to be able to play with an orchestra. You got to be able to play a bass drum roll correctly. You got to be able to play cymbal rolls correctly. It's a lot of stuff. There's a Latin section in the whole song. Like, that's why, it's not just like most shows aren't just like one thing. It's like there's going to be some other weird stuff that's going to pop up. And also, if you are only trying to do Broadway, you're going to paint yourself in a corner. You got to be able to do every gig that comes your way. I mean, Broadway, honestly, right now is probably one of the better sections to be in because it seems to be working, The recording industry is over in New York. Everyone has a home studio now, basically, if you're really trying to do this. And people just go straight to the drummer. Oh, you got a studio? I like your sound. I'll pay you to be on the record. And then touring, like I was saying earlier, unless you're in some huge Taylor Swift gig, I'm sorry, you're just not making great bread, If you're 20 and you have like a $200 a month apartment, great, go on tour, have fun. But I'm 45 and married and got a puppy at home and is like, I want to be home. One other thing I just want to add, because most of the people listening to this are obviously into Broadway, is like, we were kind of joking about this. Don't do this generic email, text thing or messaging through Instagram where it's like, hey, I'd love to pick your brain over a cup of coffee. Like, I've literally gotten a copy-paste almost version of these things. It's almost like a music school is like, hey, this is a good format to reach out to someone. And they just copy and paste. And it's like, hey, can I pay you I'd love to buy you coffee and pick your brain on Broadway. And I'm like, no. There's no secret pill of like, oh, you bought me a cup of coffee, so now you must be great. I'm going to hire you as my sub. It's
what do you recommend people do?
I say don't go after a big show like Lion King that's been around for 25 years. They probably have subs lined up. If a show is just opening, if I was just moving to New York and I wanted to get into that world, I would try to find out what shows are just opening off Broadway. A lot less pressure, and then you can probably get your foot in that door a lot easier. And it's like, you're still learning a show, right? That's what I would do first. Then if you've done a couple of those subbing off Broadways, or maybe you even get your own off-Broadway gig, when that closes, then go like, hey, I had this show, I subbed for this guy off Broadway. Is there any way I could come watch you play the book? Or even before that, are you even looking for anybody? And if you're not, cool, have a great day. But don't keep saying, well, I'm your guy. It's like, well, dude, I already have my guys. They sound great. And I check, and then I'll check out these people's playing on their Instagram or whatever, and they can barely play. I mean, I hate to be, straight up about it, but it's true. It's like, if you're going to try to go into one of the biggest cities in the world to a legit Broadway situation, you got to be able to play for real. I'm not saying I'm like Vinnie Colaiuta level player, but like if somebody says, hey, can you make this rock gig or funk gig or whatever? Cool. Whether you want to give me charts or whatever, like, let's go, and not show up and go boom, boom, bop, do, be, do, be, do, da, do, be, do. Like, there's a base level of like, you got to be able to play and like play with confidence, not cockiness. Like, you got to go in and know, like, I can nail that to the click, no problem. You're not cocky about it, but you're like, you have to be confident as a drummer, especially. If you're not confident playing a groove, it's going to feel whack, you know? And I'm lucky enough I get to play with Tom Barney every night. I mean, talk about a legendary bass player. The dude played with Miles Davis, Steely Dan, Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson. Like, he's played with everybody. You know, so that's a hard person to please. If you're a new sub coming in, he'll vibe you if it's not happening, you know?
What should a drummer who wants to be a sub on a show never do in a pit?
Play anything other than what the guy you're covering plays. There's no like, oh, I'm going to do my fill. Nope, that's not the gig. If it just says fill, yeah, maybe you could maybe it's like do a drum fill. But my whole thing was like, okay, if I'm going to learn this dude's book, I'm going to just play exactly what he's playing. You know, there's no, like, I get notes sometimes, like guys that have been in for a long time. I mean, I love my subs, but, you know, once you get comfortable, sometimes they start doing their own thing. And it could be cool, but it's like, that's not the gig, dude. It's not your time to shine. Like, the dancers and the conductor and the singers and everyone else in the pit, it's just about consistency. That's the gig. It's, if you want to do your thing and show off these cool new licks you got, great. Do it on your own band. You know, put your own band together and do it downtown. But that show... Look, I could get away with a bunch of stuff because I've been there for so long, right? And I know the music inside and out. I could start doing some crazy-ass fills and adding ghost notes here and there and doing that. It's like, I don't do that because that's not serving my job. That's not my job for those 2.5 hours. My job is to go boom, boom, like copy, paste, make it feel good, make the time great, make it feel great with the band, be constantly aware of like, oh, does the conductor want to move a little ahead right now because this new guy who got put in to be Simba is like a little bit on top of the beat? That's the stuff you're on every night, and it changes all the time.
Is your show, I saw you play it once, but are there a lot of click tracks on that show, or is it half? I think
there's like 6 for the whole show out of like 29 or 30 songs or whatever it is. So a lot of it is conducted. Most modern shows are all clicked out from the top of the show to the end of the show. It's all tracked out. Yeah,
that is true. And have you had subs that have come in and don't know how to follow a conductor? And is there certain things
they get fired?
How do you advise somebody as far as watching the conductor and watching the music? You know, how do you tell them to balance those two?
Well, I basically say by the time you should be ready to come in here, the book should be as a reference. Your face needs to be on the conductor. Like, you can check for, oh, there's a break in 4 bars. Cool. Know that, and your eyes are on the conductor. Like, you shouldn't be looking at, you really shouldn't be relying on the book at that point, right? Because, I mean, we're talking like millisecond things where if the conductor's not thinking you're watching the conductor, I mean, I've had guys that are really good drummers, like modern drummer guys, come in, learn the book. They watched me 5-6 times. Guys that can play circles around me, right? Come in, they do the gig, fired, first gig.
Damn.
Just like not hooking up with the bass player. Conductor was trying to get their attention the whole night, wasn't watching the conductor, missed a couple of the big hits on the electronic pad. They just weren't paying attention. Can't come back. And they're friends of mine. So then I have to go, hey, bro, I'm so sorry you worked on the show for the last 2 months. I can't have you back. It puts me in a weird position because I tell them, I'm like, look, this stuff is like very meticulous and it's not easy. And they're like, yeah, it's cool. I got it. I'm like, okay, cool.
If you had a warning sign before you enter this pit, before into your drum booth, so anybody wants to sub for you, this is what you need to make sure that you know before you even start doing this. Because when you come in here, I don't want you to get fired. This is what you need to do so you don't get fired.
Well, dude, that's like a 300-point list. I couldn't even start. But the two main things are must be able to actually play the drum set. That's number 1. And number 2 is must be absolutely meticulous. Those are the 2 things. If you can actually do both of those things, you'll probably do pretty well. I was teaching a clinic in Spain. There was it was probably 300 or 400 people at this clinic, right? And this guy goes, "Hey, I have a question." I was like, "Yeah, what's the question?" He goes, "I got your book. I did your book. And, I have a question about this." And I go, "Whoa." I was like, "Oh, so you bought my book?" He goes, "Yeah, it's great." And I go, "And you can play everything in the book?" He goes, "Yeah." I go, "Okay, why don't you come up here?" So I brought him up on stage and I said, I wrote the book. I know it exactly. So I was like, the second thing in the book where it's this pattern or whatever, and then you're doing these exercises with your left hand? He's like, "Yeah." I go, "Why don't you do that for me?" And he sat down and could barely hold the drumsticks. Either the guy's super nervous, right? Or he didn't know how to do any of it. Or for whatever reason, my point is, if you're going to say that in a clinic situation to the guy who wrote the book, you should probably be able to play pretty well what you're talking about, let alone the easiest passage in the book, right? So this is my thing. A lot of people say they can do one thing and they can't back it up, right? That happens a lot. Even with guys that I see videos of, I'm like, "Oh man, that guy's a good player." Then I hear them in person and I'm like, this is not the same human being. Some of it's a little smoke and mirrors, and you never know that's why it's like, go see them play live. That's the only way to tell.
Which I wish more people would do, but I don't know what the scene's like in New York City now. When we were around, when I first met you at Wetlands, there was Wetlands, there was CB's Gallery, there was CBGB's, there was Brownies,
55 bar,
and then all the jazz clubs that you could play with if you were somebody. But there was a lot more opportunities. Maybe there are now in Brooklyn. I don't know.
There's not a lot of clubs left, man. There's like the Vanguard still. That's probably the only place I would go. I've gone there a lot just because there's not. I don't really go to the Blue Note because it's like crazy expensive, and it's like, oh yeah, they played for 2 songs and then the set's over.
And $75 just for your food.
Yeah, I'm like, nah, I'm out. I'm good. I'll see you at the Vanguard. I don't know, man. It's just like, it's like with anything. If you're going to do something, do it as best. As my dad used to say, if you're going to do something, don't half-ass it. Just don't do it. But if you're going to do it, do it.
What projects are you working on at the moment?
Look, I haven't been playing out a lot just because I used to play with Charlie a lot when we would tour, and then he moved down to Greensboro and we kind of stopped, and I was just like, all right, well, I'm going to just hunker down here. And so I did a few records. I've done like three or four records now at this point. I just released my last one called Travelers, which you can only get through me. I don't stream any of my stuff because I feel like if I'm going to drop X amount of money to make this thing, I'm not just going to give it away for free. And, if people want to hear it, it's $10. Cool. Check it out. And if you don't want to hear it, that's cool too. What else? I was going to do a new record this past March with Tom Barney on upright, my friend John Solo on piano, and Rob DeBellis on bass clarinet and tenor sax. We were going to go up to the power station and record that live over 2 days. But then my dog had to have a $5,000 surgery out of nowhere. So that kind of got put on hold. I'll still probably do the record. I'll probably just do it next year. And that's it. Other than that, I'm teaching. I'm going to start teaching next year. I've taken a year and a half off from teaching privately. 2024, I'm going to start taking on like a small group of serious students.
As far as people reaching out to you, your website is?
Just CarterMcLean.com.
Anyway, man, thanks again. I really appreciate this, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Oh, man, thanks so much for having me, dude. It was great catching up.
Thank you again for joining us. If you like what you heard, subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please take a moment to give us a nice rating and review. Stay tuned for more.